Hi guys. So this is a couple of slides to get you ready to present at the AAS. It's going to be fun to present your posters, but yeah, I know it's going to be a little bit scary. It's going to start out hard. The first one you do is going to be hard, but it'll get easier and easier, and by the end it'll be easy as pie. So some basic advice. Do not stand in a clump in the front of your poster, because if you have the other people that's on the same poster shift as you and you're standing together chatting and giggling, it makes it really, really difficult for people to start a conversation with you. And in the end, blocks access not only to our poster, but the posters that are on either side of you. So if you're someone who's just walking by, seeing a group of people in front of a poster is really intimidating, especially if you are giggling and chatting. So don't do that. Spread out a little bit in front of the poster. You can try and snag people passing by. Hey, we studied these young stars. We found 250 new ones. Come, let me tell you about it. If there's nobody passing by, which there might not be, you can ask the people at the nearby posters. Especially if they're a youngish person, they will love it. But you don't want to interrupt them, though. If they're already talking to somebody else, you don't want to interrupt them. But if there's nobody coming by all means, talk to everyone around you. Find out what they're presenting in their poster. If you do end up with a crowd that is in front of your poster, that's fine. That's great. It means you're popular. But try to be polite to the posters on either side of you. If you're going to have, 15 people in front of you, try not to block access to the other posters. And by all means, help each other during your presentation. If you get a tough question, help each other. Do not make stuff up. Because some of the people listening to you, they might not be in star formation and they might not catch your errors. But I'm going to be spending a significant amount of my time between now and our poster day sending people to see you. I give them a slip of paper in which all of the NITARP posters are written down, and I say, hey, please go talk to these people. They worked really hard. So the people who are going to be listening to you are my friends and colleagues, and most of them do star formation, and they will catch your errors. So rather than making stuff up, admit when you don't know something. If they ask a question that you're not sure about the answer, you can say, I'm not sure, but I think that... And that gives them an opportunity to correct you if they do know the answer to that question. And since there's going to be more than one of you standing by the poster at the same time, help each other. If your colleague, if your teammate has something incorrect during their presentation or seems to be just sort of floundering around, by all means, back them up. Step in and help and make sure that the right information is getting conveyed. For the most part, astronomers are very friendly people. They're not going to try to make you feel bad. They're not going to come at you very aggressively. But know that this is how science works. Being able to handle the criticism is important because they're not criticizing you personally. They're not saying you're a bad person in any way. They're saying that they didn't understand what you did in this step. Or they're saying, I have a better way to do this step, and here's how. So when they ask questions, they're not trying to trap you. They're trying to understand what we did. They're trying to help you understand better what we did, because they might know the answer to the question before they ask. I mean, maybe they're trying to test you to see how deep your knowledge is, but that's okay, because you know more about this than anyone else at the AAS. You know more about what we did than anyone else there. So you know what you're talking about. Then these people might also be pointing out weaknesses in our work or analysis techniques we haven't thought of or ways to go forward. So don't take it personally. They're not trying to make you feel bad. They're trying to understand what you did, and they're trying to help you make it better. So now, here's an example of what a poster presentation might sound like. Hey, you want to come learn about a poster? We found 250 new young stars in Cepheus.
That sounds great. Tell me about it.
So what we did was we started with a whole bunch of young star candidates selected in a variety of ways. And of those candidates, we spent a lot of time looking at spectral energy distributions and images and color magnitude diagrams trying to figure out what we believed.
And what type of data did you use?
Well, we have data from a lot of different places. So the project that we're leveraging off of is something called YSOVAR, and it's a program that monitored a dozen young star regions looking to try to understand variability in young stars at 3.5 and 4.5 microns with Spitzer. And this particular cluster, they haven't done a lot of work in yet. And it turns out that because it's in the galactic plane, there's a lot of serendipitous data that have been obtained, but really nobody has sat down and looked at the individual sources like we did. Here's a map of the region. There's a 24 micron MIPS image from Spitzer in the background. And these two pairs of blue squares and the two pairs of red squares are single epoch observations taken with Spitzer of the core, the heart of Ceph C there. And because of the way the orbits work, we end up smearing, right? So that's one epoch, and the next epoch is a little bit further off and further off and further off. So the IRAC 1, 3.5 micron coverage in the end sort of looks like a fan like that. And then the that's IRAC 2. IRAC 1 is the blue because it's shorter, and it's kind of like a fan like that. So, and the yellow footprint is what we have in X-rays. So what we did was we started with this basic region, which is about 0.35 degrees on a side. And all of those little numbered sources are the sources that we worried about when we went through and collected data. We had data from a lot of different places. So we had, in addition to the Spitzer YSOVAR monitoring, which is 3.5 and 4.5 microns, turns out a big galactic plane survey with Spitzer called GLIMPSE at 3.5 and 4.5 microns also looked at this area, as well as Spitzer when it still had cryogen. It had 4 channels in IRAC and 3 channels in MIPS. It also observed this region. There's also WISE data at 3.5, 4.5, 12, and 22 microns. Then there's also 2 optical surveys, IFAS, which was RI and H alpha, and Sloan, which is UGRI and Z. So we started out with more than 27,000 sources, and we obtained almost 300 sources by doing a combination of things to pick out likely young stars. We did a series of multiple color, and color magnitude IR cuts to try to identify the IR bright, IR excess young stars. We also looked for stars that had X-ray detections and were likely to be stars rather than background active galactic nuclei. And because we have the time series data, we can also look for young stars that are variable, both variable during the 40 days that we observed it, but also variable between our YSOVAR campaign and the cryo-era Spitzer observations that were done several years prior. There'd also, because we have the IFAS data, there's a couple of stars with very strong H alpha in this region too. So that those 300 sources were made up of young stars selected in a variety of different ways. And because they were all blindly done with the computer just picking out what it thought was right, we learned very quickly that just because the computer says it doesn't mean it's right. And you do have to go back and look at the sources in the images and make sure that you're matching the correct source across the wavelengths, because we have a variety of hugely different spatial resolutions here. And so sometimes more than one source in Spitzer can be just one source in WISE. And you have to be careful with how you're matching the sources across bands. We also created spectral energy distributions, or SEDs, for each of the candidate sources that we found. So here are some example spectral energy distributions.
So just so I'm clear, it sounds like you used all of these different wavelengths to select your sources, but then you made sure that you detected them in each wavelength as well?
Well, it didn't have to be detected in each wavelength, but that they had to be, if they were detected, they were circular and not artifacts, right? And they were matched appropriately across wavelengths, because if you have optical data from one source but infrared data from another source that's right nearby, you're not measuring the same source.
And each one was vetted by hand?
Yes, that's what we spent most of our time doing, is looking at images of each of these sources over all the different wavelengths that we could obtain. We also made SEDs, and that helped us look for things that were matched incorrectly across bands, because the SEDs should be smooth, and if they're discontinuous, it means that we haven't matched the source correctly across bands. So here are just 5 sample SEDs that we found. So the points here is this is lambda F lambda, or energy density, as a function of wavelength. And the crosses and triangles are optical data from Sloan and IFAS. Our scientist mentor colored the red point there is H alpha, and the reason she colored it that way is because young stars are often bright in H alpha. So it was useful to remember which one of these points was H alpha. Similarly, she colored the blue point, the U point from Sloan here, blue. So, because again, young stars could have an ultraviolet excess. So it's useful to remember which one of these points was the U band as well. The diamonds are JH and K from 2MASS. The stars are the 4 bands from WISE. The circles are the 4 bands from IRAC. And the square there is MIPS 24. So what we have here is an SED that's pretty much monotonically rising. This black line here, this continuous line, is just a line to guide the eye. In this particular case, K is an upper limit. But if K had been a detection at that location, that is where a plain star without dust should expect to have all the rest of those wavelengths fall. And clearly this object, the star, doesn't. It has a steadily rising energy as a function of wavelength. And that green line there is a fit to all of the available data between 2 and 25 microns. And from that slope, we know that it's an SED class 1. Here's another one. Here we have J, that's an upper limit, H and K, and then a pretty flat spectrum source. Here you can see that MIPS 24 is MIPS 24, which is a square, is a little bit lower energy density than WISE 22. And that's because WISE has worse spatial resolution. And so that measurement that's a little too high probably encompasses some emission from the nebulosity. And 24 microns is probably a better estimate of the true flux of this object. Here's another one that has lots of optical data and a pretty big disk. This one doesn't have very much disk at all. This was almost certainly selected via X-rays as opposed to an infrared excess because it doesn't really have an infrared excess.
Look at that.
And then this one, so while we were looking at all the SEDs, we noticed a really interesting pattern. There was one that didn't look anything like the SEDs that Louisa gave us. It looked totally different. And she wasn't sure what to make of them, nor were we at first. So we put them all together in a bin so we could keep track of how many we found. And we called them zigzags. In this particular case, it doesn't look much like a zigzag, but if you remove those JH and K points, you can kind of see that it kind of looks like a zigzag. And the linear fit between 2 and 25 microns doesn't do a good job of capturing all the bumps and wiggles that are in that SED. So we found 7 of these, and we sort of put them in a pile by themselves and tried to figure out what they were by looking at where they fell in the image and where they fell in color magnitude diagrams. We expected to try to do some vetting of young stars for all of our candidates by looking at color, and color magnitude diagrams. Let me make these a little bit bigger here. So here I have 5 example because we had data from Sloan U through MIPS 24. It's a huge number of colors and magnitudes that we can use to vet our candidates. So here are some infrared ones. This is WISE 1 versus WISE 1 minus WISE 3. That purple line is where main sequence stars should be. The colored points are all of our young star candidates, and the colors of them correspond to their SED class. So these are the reddest with the steepest slope. The yellow is the flat, the green is class 2, and blue is class 3. In other words, not very much infrared excess. And that kind of makes sense for where they fall, where they fall in this diagram. Those orange numbers there correspond to the orange numbers up here. So source number 174 is that orange point that's on that line. So you can see that this zigzag source, where we're not quite sure what they are, is in the right place to be a really strong infrared excess young star. The other stars that have enough data to appear in this plot also do. If you draw a line with your eye back to the solid orange point, that's right. So this one is an infrared color diagram, WISE 1 minus WISE 2 versus WISE 3 minus WISE 4. Stars that are main sequence stars should be at color 0. And here again, all of our stars are this huge, they're very red, very, very red, which is what we expect for young stars. Here we have J minus H versus H minus K. This is a much more complicated diagram in no small part because we have a lot more points in this diagram than we do the others. Here reddening is starting to matter. That purple squiggle in there is where main sequence stars without an infrared excess should lie, and they should all be down here. Some of our stars are down there, to be sure. The smear that goes up this way is where just plain main sequence stars would be if they were just reddened, if they were just behind the cloud we care about. This line here is where stars would be if they are very young and have big, big, big honking disks. They would be here, and certainly some of our stars are reddened versions of where they might be.
And what about that red one down there?
So that's a weird one. That one is 125. So if we go over and look at 125, you can see he's got a limit at K. And so to put him in this plot, we sort of faked it a little bit, and you can see that the K measurement is just not right because it's not in the right place to be a legitimately strong young star. It's too far down into the right. This one too is a little bit worrisome. It may very well be that there's something wrong with that guy's photometry too. Now, one thing that really nobody has done yet is combine the infrared with the optical. And so these last 2 plots is the work that we were doing, extending this kind of analysis to the optical. So if Sloan R versus Sloan R minus I, the purple solid line there is the 10 million year isochron. In other words, main sequence stars at the distance of Cepheus should be around that solid line. That's the 2 million year isochrone. So all of our stars should be basically in between 10 million years and 2 million years for this cluster. And you can see that we do have quite a few stars that are in between those isochrones. We also have some interesting stars hanging out down here. I'm going to talk more about those in a second. There's IFAS R minus H alpha and IFAS R minus I, reddening vector. The purple is again where main sequence stars fall. And all these guys up here are ones that are really, really bright in H alpha and could legitimately be young stars because they're actively accreting. Now, the guys that are down there is very interesting. One of the other things we noticed when we were looking at images, Louisa had originally said that we shouldn't really worry about SEDs that have only 1 or 2 points because there's not much we can do with them. But when we were doing this, we realized that for some cases, the reason the SEDs had only 1 or 2 points was not because they were faint background objects, but because they were hanging out in this really bright region next to these really bright stars. And so it's not that they don't have a well-populated SED because they're background objects. They don't have a well-populated SED because they're living in downtown South Sea, and they're in the middle of this mess, and they're not going to, you can't get the whole well-populated SED because it's too embedded for optical and it's too close to the bright sources to get a lot of points in the infrared. So what we did was we drew a polygon around the very brightest sources that were sort of clumped together and the really brightest nebulosity. So anything inside those magenta contours, we dubbed guilt by association because they were sort of in the right place. So all of those sources marked with G's are the ones that are inside those polygons. In other words, they're guilt by association. They're probably young stars. We just don't know exactly. We don't have enough data to tell. And a lot of these points that are down here are the stragglers that are just barely detected in the optical. And that's why they're still hanging on. We left them in the set of reliable young stars because of their physical location in the sky. Now, it'd be nice if we had some more information. So of all of the 250 young stars that we identified, those are the ones that have the most circumstantial evidence, right? They were at the location when the murder occurred. They were at the location, and in the right projected location on the sky. But we really do need some additional data to make sure that they're really young stars. For all of these stars, technically they are still young star candidates until we get some follow-up spectroscopy, but that's the kind of thing that we can do next. We can also look for longer... We can also look for long wavelength... We can also look for long wavelength counterparts in the Herschel and Scuba data in this region. We can look at formal clustering, look for subclusters within this cluster. And all of this is going to feed into the YS over our light curves and trying to understand the variability properties of young stars. Because once we understand what the ratios are between 1, flat, 2, and 3 here of the 245 YSOs that we have, 13% of them are class 1, 15% are flat, 38% are 2, and 31% are 3s, and 3% we just don't have enough points in the SED to know. So given the relative fractions of that, once we compare that to the other YS of our clusters, we'll be able to put them in a sort of a relative age order and then look at the variability properties of young stars across all of these YS of our clusters.
That's very interesting. And did you do this work as a student?
So I'm a high school teacher, and these are my high school students, and we did this as a part of a program called NITARP, the NASA IPAC Teacher Archive Research Program. So we've been working with their scientist mentor for a year since the last AAS meeting. We went out to visit her for a week in the summer, and we've been working remotely for most of that time.
Well, that's really great. I'm very interested in astronomy education, and if you have any bright students, please let me know.
That'd be great. I'm sure they'd love summer jobs.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.